A drunken father, a sick mother, a lonely childhood spent in boarding schools, endless depression, and battling epilepsy. Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky, who became famous in the second half of the 19th century and became one of the most recognized writers in the West, managed to leave his mark on an entire century. So who is Dostoevsky? What are his works? Dostoevsky was born in Moscow in 1821 in a poor home. Poverty, which gripped him as soon as he was born, followed him throughout his life. He spent an unhappy childhood with an alcoholic, angry father who was a doctor and a sick mother. He was the second child of a family of 6. He lost his mother first, and then his father to tuberculosis at a young age. He became depressed because he thought he wanted his father's death. His epilepsy also appeared during these years. After studying engineering in Petersburg, young Dostoevsky turned to literature. While working nights to earn money and translating Balzac and Schiller, he had the drafts of his first novel, Poor People, read to the poet Nikolai Nekrasov. Nekrasov, who read the drafts, would soon introduce his writer friend to Belinsky, one of the most well-known critics of the period, as a new Gogol is growing. Belinsky's response was humiliating. Gogols are growing like mushrooms in your place too. But when he read what the young man had written the next day, Belinsky's opinion changed. He looked at Dostoevsky and said, "Do you realize what you have achieved here?" That day, the young writer walked down the street in tears, as if drunk. He was experiencing joy and pain, pride and humiliation, all at the same time. He narrowly escaped execution when he met Petrushev in 1846. His life would take a different turn to socialism. Shortly afterwards, Petrushevsky carried out an unsuccessful uprising against the Tsar. This meant the start of the hunt for socialists in this country. Dostoevsky was also arrested by soldiers who entered his room one night without questioning him. He was kept in a cell in a fortress for 10 months without being told what he was accused of, waiting for the verdict to be given about him. This wait was harder than anything else for him. When the verdict came, everything was over. The verdict was like a knife. Death. He would be executed by shooting in the square with other rebels. He was executed with 9 of his friends. While he was waiting for his death, in the square wearing his shirt, something happened at the last moment. The officer who was going to give the order raised his hand minutes before the execution and read the decision that his death sentence was commuted to imprisonment. He would serve 4 years of hard labor and 4 years of ordinary prison. He was sent to Omsk prison in Siberia to serve his sentence. During his time as a hard laborer, his arms were branded, his head was shaved, and he broke stones. He was hospitalized many times due to epileptic seizures. From Dostoevsky's house in Russia, which was turned into a museum, he moved to this building at the address known as Kuznechny Peryulok, 5/2, with his family in October 1878. He lived here until his death on January 28, 1881. He wrote The Brothers Karamazov in this house. Dostoevsky in the grip of epilepsy. During his years in Siberia, when writing was forbidden, he had no books with him other than the Bible. He stayed there for 4 years with bandits, thieves, and murderers. He stayed in Siberia for a few more years, in despair, and married the widowed Maria Dmitrievna Isayeva out of pity for her. Then he returned to Petersburg in 1859. But he was a forgotten man. In that loneliness, he wrote Memoirs from the House of the Dead. The book reached the Kremlin. The Tsar read the pages with sobs. The fame he had escaped from the brink of his first book was now at his doorstep once more. The difficult years seemed to be behind him. Now he would feel some relief in his soul. But this did not last long. The newspaper he founded was banned. The years of suffering began again. Deaths followed one another. First his wife, then his brother and assistant died. A heavy debt was placed on his shoulders. One night he fled abroad like a criminal to escape from creditors. The breath of the disease was always on his neck. Epilepsy was numbing his brain. The foam pouring from his mouth and the tremors that gripped his body would soon take him to the heights of pleasure. But after each epileptic seizure, he found himself in the arms of pain and suffering again. Sometimes the seizure he had while writing made him forget all the characters and events he had created. Thanks to his strong will, all the distorted images would regain clarity in his mind after a while. Until a new seizure. This was how he would write his greatest novels. In pursuit of truth, and often in delirium on the verge, always with an immodesty, there was no measure to the spiritual excitements he experienced, nor to the great destructions he suffered. From the Dostoevsky Museum in Russia, which began to be preserved as a museum on the 150th anniversary of his birth, the writer's desk. There were two small libraries, a desk, and a large sofa behind the desk in the room. He often slept on the sofa in this room. In the midst of illness and poverty, one way to reach this spiritual excitement would be gambling. He met roulette in Europe. This game gave him more than many worldly pleasures. His life was like being on the edge of a spinning roulette wheel. He played recklessly. Sometimes he won, sometimes he lost. One day, he put his entire being, even his soul, on the table. During the years when he was wandering the streets with a deep longing for Russia, he married his secretary, Anna Grigorievna Snitkina, for the second time. The years of misery continued here. He walked unannounced on the same street with his contemporaries Richard Wagner, Nietzsche, Flaubert. He wrote novels that believed in the roots of the human soul, such as crime and punishment, and the possessed, here in the midst of debt, illness, and poverty. He created sick characters whose souls fed on chaos. His only material was humans. The underground man, Prince Mishkin, Raskolnikov. Then his daughter died, and he went through a great shock. 30,000 people attended his funeral. After returning to Russia, which he had longed for at the age of 52, he wrote A Writer's Diary and his most profound novel, The Brothers Karamazov, which would take him to the top. The suffering he suffered was giving way to a sense of victory again. He was asked to give a speech at a meeting held in Pushkin's honor. That day, he gave a mesmerizing speech that went ecstatically. The hall was filled with enthusiasm. The eyes of the women were on him. In fact, a young audience member fainted from excitement while listening to him. All the other speakers gave up their time to him so that they could listen to him more. Dostoevsky died in the attic of the fourth floor of his house in a workers' neighborhood on a stormy January day in 1881. Thousands of people from different parts of Russia came to see his body after hearing the news. The thousands of ornamental flowers placed on him disappeared within a few hours. One by one, the visitors took the flowers off him. The candles burning in the small room where the dead man was found also went out after a while due to lack of air. Approximately 30,000 people walked behind his coffin at the funeral ceremony held for Dostoevsky on January 31st, 1881. Poor People Dostoevsky's first novel, Poor People, is also considered the first Russian social novel. The main theme of the novel, as in other Dostoevsky novels, is pity. A short and social novel written in the form of an epistolary novel, Poor People is about an old clerk's love for a little girl and his efforts to show respect for this girl. Although Poor People was Dostoevsky's first work, it is one of his most important novels. The other, The main character of Dostoevsky's novella The Other, published in 1846, is Yakov Petrovich Goladkin, a ninth-degree civil servant. One morning, Goladkin sees a clerk sitting across from his desk at work, who has the same name as him and looks exactly like him. This is his twin, something like his other self. A ridiculous struggle begins between these two that will eventually drive Goladkin to madness. Goladkin is one of the first examples of a problem that Dostoevsky will encounter in The Possessed, The Adolescent, and, albeit indirectly, in Crime and Punishment's Raskolnikov, the split types who seek the identity of individuals and try to establish it. In this novel, Dostoevsky presents one of the most perfect examples of the technique of constructing the individual's world from the inside out, in terms of consciousness, which we also see in Kafka. The world constructed by the split consciousness is as strange as it is frightening, meaningless, and dangerous. Natochka Nezvanova. Natochka Nezvanova, Dostoevsky's first novel, written in 1849 but never completed, means nameless nobody. The first completed part of the book was published at the end of 1849. The reason why the novel did not continue was that Dostoevsky was arrested for participating in revolutionary activities and exiled to Siberia. In 1859, Dostoevsky was exiled from Siberia. He returned, but did not take up this novel again. Therefore, this story remained unfinished forever. The book tells the story of a young girl living in poverty in Petersburg. This orphaned girl is adopted by a well-off upper-class family, and when she meets her new stepsister Katya, she suddenly falls madly in love with her. The two soon become inseparable. Despite this, one day, Katya is forced to leave Moscow by her family and lives with Katya's sister for 8 years. In the following days, Katya's sister becomes a mother figure for her. The story ends abruptly before the two girls can reunite. The Oppressed. The novel, which was first published in 1861, is one of Dostoevsky's most successful works. In this novel, as in his other novels, the author includes psychological analyses, allowing the reader to take on the psychology of the characters. The novel deals with the crushing and shaking of people who are always despised and looked down upon in society amidst the selfish calculations of influential people. Dostoevsky leaves the reader in a state of curiosity mixed with a shiver of fear with the characters he chooses, who surprise him with their ordinary but extraordinary lives. Memoirs from the House of the Dead. Dostoevsky tells the story of struggle and hope in this book. He sheds light on the humanity of Goryanchikov, Akim Akimich, Petrov, Ali, and all the prisoners, and describes them. In this book, we see that the author conveys his experiences from the Siberian exile to the reader. The state of spiritual melancholy seen in Dostoevsky is also impressively handled in this novel. This memoir novel, compiled from his 4-year imprisonment in Siberia, brought him back to his former dignity. Notes from the Underground is a classic that influenced many Western thinkers in an existential sense. Published in Petersburg in 1864, the novel tells the inner conflicts and deliriums of a person who has isolated himself from the real world. Dostoevsky, who enters the novel with the underground man's monologue and the famous phrase, "I am a sick man," sets out with this narrative to the great works of his later period. He made an introduction. The first part of the novel consists of the character's confessions, reproaches, insults, regrets, in short, a monologue about his inner world. He writes very open expressions of a closed character who disgusts the people around him, remembers them with hatred, and perhaps never loved people. In the second part, we watch the man emerge from the underground and try to settle accounts with people who were understood to be his friends before. Dostoevsky entered his new era with this novel. Zeki Demirkubuz made the film Underground as a free adaptation of Notes from the Underground in 2012. Crime and Punishment. Written by Dostoevsky upon his return from exile, Crime and Punishment is the first great novel of the author's mature period. Crime and Punishment focuses on the spiritual suffering and moral dilemmas of Rodion Raskolnikov, a poor student in Petersburg who devises a plan to kill a loan shark for his money. The Gambler. The Gambler, in which Dostoevsky wrote about his youth, dramatic love, and passion for gambling in the most simple way, was completed in 25 days. The Idiot. In this work, Dostoevsky touches upon the difficulties of living as an honest and open person in a world centered on an epileptic young man and describes the hypocrisy of society. To be honest in such a world is to be idiot. The novel is extremely fluent and deep as a Dostoevsky classic. In the work, which is heavily dominated by psychological elements loaded with tension and discharges, Dostoevsky wants to draw the ideal man type. The Possessed, a political novel, The Possessed examines and criticizes the effects of Western thought on Russia and Russian people, along with ideologies such as atheism, nihilism, and socialism in the second half of the 19th century. Dostoevsky wrote the book between 1870 and 1872 after returning from Siberian exile. For this reason, the conservative views of his later years are strongly felt in the book. The book examines the damage that extremist ideologies such as socialism and nihilism have on the social structure. The Brothers Karamazov. The Brothers Karamazov is known as Dostoevsky's pinnacle novel. A large part of the novel was written in Staraya Russa. Dostoevsky spent nearly 2 years on the novel, which has a heavy language, and finished it in November 1880. He died approximately 4 months after the book was published, while working on a large-scale project he had prepared for this book, Memoirs of a Great Sinner.